House Harkonnen's new truth-sayer.
Impressive.
We said this in another video, but Dune Prophecy should have been titled Dune House Harkonnen because it pretty much serves as their hidden backstory. In the original Dune saga, the Harkonnens served no other purpose than being the big bads for Paul Atreides to slay. They're Nazi Germany to Paul's allied Fremen. Denis Villenueve makes this association even more explicit with that military parade scene from Dune Part Two, but the expanded Dune-iverse is where we really get to understand the depths of Harkonnen depravity, and also how they were the hidden hand that swayed the Imperium for 10,000 years. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the hidden history of House Harkonnen, their fall from grace and rise to power, as well as how they shaped the very fabric of the Dune storyline, all the way down to God Emperor of Dune. So, without further ado, strap in for what's going to be a hell of a ride. Before we get too deep into it though, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. It's a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The descendants of Tsars and kings from Earth, allegedly. The Terran history of Harkonnens. While Frank Herbert established his characters and their inner philosophies rather well, when it came to detailing their family histories, he was no George Martin. The Atreides got at least something of a historical background, seeing as Frank made overt references to their Greek heritage in the first 4 books, but for the Harkonnens, he pretty much rolled the dice on picking the harshest sounding name he could. While scrolling through a phone book, yes, phone books back when they were a thing, he found the name Harkonnen, and liking how Soviet it sounded, Frank was a Cold War novelist after all, he decided to use it for his main villains. He would discover the Finnish roots of the name years later by himself, which the Dune Encyclopedia leans into and fleshes out quite a bit. It might have been disavowed as non-canon by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson, but the Dune Encyclopedia is a treasure trove of information about the Dune-iverse that might not always be accurate, but never fails at piquing your interest all the same. According to that Frank-approved guidebook, the Harkonnens could trace their ancestry back to the 20th century on Earth, which was at least 20,000 years before the encyclopedia was compiled. It tells us that the Harkonnen bloodline originates from 2 of the most powerful empires that Eastern Europe has ever seen, the Byzantine Empire and Tsarist Russia. On their paternal side, the Harkonnens claim descent from Thomas Palaiologos, the brother of the last Byzantine emperor Constantine XI, who died trying to reclaim his family's throne. On their maternal side, the Harkonnens claim descent from Kirill Romanov, who was the first cousin of Emperor Nicholas II and the final relevant claimant to Russia's throne. You'll notice a pattern emerging. The Harkonnens have never exactly been the guys in power. They've always been the guys too late to the party, and that will continue to be true of them thousands of years later as well. In a way, when the first Harkonnen couple got together, they united 2 branches of the same bloodline, because Thomas Palaiologos' daughter Zoe was married to Ivan the Great, whose son, Ivan the Terrible, married Anastasia Romanova, turning the House of Romanov into the royal house. They wouldn't take outright control of Tsarist Russia until the time of troubles was over, but once it was, the Romanovs used their lineage to gain control of all Russia. It's interesting to see that even the earthly ancestors of the Harkonnens were more infamous than famous, because the Byzantines and the Romanovs weren't exactly popular for their benevolence. Both cultures shaped the historic reputation of Eastern Europe being a den of snakes and spiders, and that's reflected in their supposed descendants. The Harkonnens use assassination as a means of advancing soldiers through the ranks. They use every possible drug known to humanity and inflict every possible torture upon those they subjugate. The ruthlessness of Fade Rautha and Vladimir Harkonnen is in many ways worse than Gulag justice, and the fact that the Harkonnen homeworld in Prophecy is the ice planet of Lankyvale is more than just a subtle nod to this heritage of theirs. Over the course of thousands of years, the descendants of the Palaiologos dynasty found themselves adrift in space and part of the first galactic empire of mankind. It's here that their contributions to human society end up shaping their civilization, and indeed, the Imperium at large. The rise and fall of House Harkonnen. What sparked the Atreides-Harkonnen rivalry? The Dune Encyclopedia and the Brian Herbert prequel books give us 2 different versions of how the Harkonnens rose and fell from power, but they both have 2 details that are consistent with each other. The fact that a man called Abulurd Harkonnen was unjustly betrayed by an Atreides during the Battle of Corran, and his banishment from the Imperium is what sparked the rivalry between these 2 great houses. In the Dune Encyclopedia, this happens as part of a larger conflict between humans. In the aftermath of the Butlerian Jihad, which ended with the destruction of Abraham von Holtzmann in 108 BG, the universe came to be dominated by cultures that thought it anarchical to have planetary governments. The Landsraad, which had existed for a couple millennia already, did all that it could to maintain its hold over the remnants of the old empire, but there was ample space for a new power to emerge and fill in the vacuum. That power turned out to be the Sardaukar of the planet Salusa Secundus, who, in the encyclopedia, are native inhabitants of the world, not just Imperial troops. The Sardaukar evolved in an environment of constant chaos and conflict, with their customs being even worse than those of old Sparta. Sardaukar males were subject to frequent tests like assassination assessment and physical endurance, and twice a year, Sardaukar children were dumped out into the harshest parts of the world as part of a survival challenge. The females were made to bear children as soon as they became fertile, and upon reaching the age of maturity, the best life they could hope for was to become a tribe chief's wife. Becoming a concubine was commonplace, and it was through these adverse conditions that the Sardu tribe evolved into becoming the formidable Sardaukar. They eventually organized themselves under the Bursegs of the Essavit family and took over governance of Salusa Secundus, following which they assaulted the allied worlds of the Landsraad. The climactic battle of the Sardaukar's campaign took place at Corrin, which is where their Bashar, Abulurd Harkonnen, ended up betraying them. Though they were fierce ground assault troops who were on par with the Fremen, or maybe even better, the Sardaukar lacked the sheer manpower of the Landsraad. Their leader, Shuset Kostin, possessed only 24 starships for this planetary assault, and this knowledge was passed on to his enemies by Abulurd. When the battle for Corrin began, the Landsraad arrived with a fleet thrice the size of the Sardaukar legions, and Abulurd also ended up retreating to the back of the line, further reducing their numbers. But through a clever deployment strategy and the courage of Demetrios Atreides, Shuset's forces were able to secure victory in the Battle of Corrin, but it also forced the two sides into a tactical deadlock. From this point onward, this war would become a war of attrition. Both sides knew that pressing an attack would only guarantee mutual destruction because the Sardaukar had just laid waste to thrice their numbers while dealing with an internal mutiny. Shuset was willing to press the attack until the entire Landsraad Council was at his mercy, but he knew that in doing so he would be creating a universal graveyard for himself to rule over. So he negotiated with them instead, and through the Treaty of Corrin, rose up as Shuset Corrino, the first Padishah Emperor of the known universe. Abulurd Harkonnen was dismissed, stripped of his ranks and honors, and sent into exile. The new emperor didn't execute him because, according to legend, they shared the same blood. Abulurd's ancestor Harkonnen Obashev was said to be a demi-brother of Shuset's father Kostin. They were brothers, so Shuset did not wish to have kin's blood on his hands, but he didn't give that treatment to all Harkonnens in existence. When Abulurd had betrayed his family, his brother Ivan did not. Instead, he selflessly sacrificed himself to protect his comrades, and for that, Shuset rewarded his son Nikolai with the Duchy of Elazai as well as several lucrative wine monopolies. Maybe he shouldn't have done that if he didn't want to foster rebellion in his new empire, but that's us getting ahead of ourselves. In the Dune Encyclopedia, the Harkonnen exile makes sense and ends up justifying itself when they end up making constant plays for the Imperial throne over the next 10,000 years. It establishes them as dirty politicians and domineering slavers from the start, and the one honorable Harkonnen that ever existed ended up birthing a dynasty of usurpers. In the extended Dune-iverse, Abulurd is still the man that betrays Imperial forces during the Battle of Corrin, but the entire context of his treason has been altered to fit the overarching war between humanity and thinking machines. In the Brian Herbert books, the Butlerian Jihad continues well after its formal conclusion in 180 BG. Because it only manages to isolate the machines from their capital planet of Corrin instead of eliminating them altogether. And Abulurd does abandon his post, but he does it for reasons that are nobler than you'd think. In this new canon, the first-named Harkonnen isn't Obashev, it's a man called Ulf, and he's a lot like the Baron Vladimir that we know and hate. Ulf was a wealthy member of the League of Nobles, having exclusive rights to mine the diamonds of the jewel planet Hagal. He employed slaves in his endeavors to become the most prosperous member of the League and showed no compassion towards them, but that couldn't be said for his wife and sons. Katerina Harkonnen was as gentle as Ulf was cruel, and his eldest son Piers was trying to change the family's ways. He took to calling his slave miners workers and instituted guidelines that would have seen them get treated more humanely. Ulf, of course, disapproved of this and sought to teach his son a lesson by taking him to Salusa Secundus, but that's when tragedy struck. His starship was attacked by a group of Cymex being led by the Titan General Agamemnon. A few centuries before, Agamemnon had risen up and subjugated all of humanity with his titans, but then lost control over their fate to a program of his making, the Omnius Evermind. The thinking machines assumed control of the Empire and the cybernetic bodies of him and his titans and proceeded to systematically eliminate humans from the cosmos. Agamemnon hated working for something he had made, but he hated humans even more, so he complied with Omnius until he found an opportunity to liberate his brothers and sisters. In his pursuit of the Harkonnens, he not only blew up their vessel, and he also chased down Piers, who crash-landed on the future Atreides home planet of Caladan. Agamemnon fought and tracked him, but because he'd taken refuge with a clan of wandering Zensuni, Piers was able to resist capture. Before you ask us how these guys reached Caladan of all places, let us just tell you a lot about the extended Dune-iverse doesn't make sense. Regardless, Agamemnon found his mark, he couldn't defeat him, and Piers was assumed dead by the universe at large. This transferred leadership of House Harkonnen to his younger brother Xavier, who became the first Harkonnen to disgrace the family name. Throughout most of his life, Xavier was perceived as a great military leader and a hero of the Butlerian jihad against thinking machines. At the age of 19, he took command of humanity's defenders on the League capital when the thinking machines executed a surprise attack, and though the losses were tremendous, Xavier's strategy was what ensured mankind didn't perish that day. He went on to become the architect of the League's attack on Earth, which saw them destroy the planet and Omnius Prime with the use of atomics and of various other key assignments during the Jihad. Through his brief affair with Serena Butler, he became the father of the martyr that sparked the Great Machine War, Mannion the Innocent, and through her sister Octa, he'd become the ancestor of two separate dynasties. Now, before you think of him as some sort of pre-redemption space Oliver Queen, let us clarify that when Xavier got together with Octa, he didn't even know that Serena was alive, let alone pregnant with his child. She'd been reported missing since her plan to liberate Getty Prime went awry, and he'd assumed he'd never see her again. He'd always flirted with Octa as well, but now he saw her in a different light, and that led to him fathering 3 girls with her, Rowella, Omilia, and Wandra. Through his years of military service to the League, Xavier became close friends with his fellow Primero Vorian Atreides, the former machine trustee who betrayed them to side with humanity. Their conflicting styles of leadership and approach to battle was what made them such a formidable duo, and indeed, this might have been the only time in history that an Atreides and Harkonnen were friends. This friendship is what Xavier must have been counting on when he came to the realization that his purpose was being perverted by its professed leader. Xavier didn't exactly emerge unscathed from his historic performance at the First Battle of Zimia. Cymek tech and destruction fried his lungs out, and he needed to get replacement organs from the Tlulaxans. Of course, at first, the entire League was content with dealing with these shady people from the edge of the universe because organ replacements were necessary at the time. The Tlulaxans told everyone that they grew their replacements in organ labs, but during a state visit to their home planet with the leader of the Jihad, Iblis Ginjo, Xavier learned the truth. He discovered one of his old soldiers, who had been presumed dead, being abused as an organ donor, and he learned that the Tlulaxans were attacking humans for their replacements with the consent of Iblis. He sent a covert message to Vorian regarding this revelation, and then took it upon himself to deal with the treacherous Grand Patriarch. Xavier flew their starship into the star Thalim as he and Iblis departed Tlulax, but his message of truth was twisted into falsehood. No one was ready to believe that their beloved leader was a secret organ harvester and slaver, and even Vorian's reputation couldn't convince them of Xavier's truth. In the end, the Primero had to let go of his efforts to clear his buddy's name, because in doing so he was dividing the human war effort, and that wasn't something they could afford. Xavier's wife reverted to using her family name Butler due to his disgraceful acts, and so did her girls. At a time when the Butlerian name was being canonized by humanity, Octa and her children would at least not have to worry about being targeted by internal saboteurs as much, considering the fact that attacking them would be akin to attacking the Jihad itself. Her youngest daughter Wandra ended up marrying one of the Primeros that made a name for himself during the first half of the Jihad, Quentin Vigar, and it was through him that Abulard Harkonnen would come into existence, only his birth title was Butler. Quentin also took on his wife's title when he married her, and they had 2 children besides Abulard, a middle child called Rykov and their eldest son and heir, Fakan Butler. All 3 of them became part of the war effort, but their lives couldn't have been more different from each other. Rykov became a war hero through his contributions to the Jihad and was granted the planet Parmentier as his fief to rule. This is the same planet where the Suk school would develop in a few years. Fakan was a warrior initially, but when the Jihad came to a formal end, he became a politician and eventually rose to the position of interim viceroy of the League of Nobles. He would also claim the title of Grand Patriarch with his niece Rhaena's help, becoming the official leader of the jihad effort, and this put him in the driver's seat of humanity. Fakan would end up combining his two titles into a new one, Padishah Emperor of the known universe. He would discard his family name Butler and assume the title Corrino to reflect humanity's victory over the thinking machines at Corran and establish a dynasty that lasted 10,000 years. And though Abelard became a Bashar in his own right, he was the only Butler brother to go down in infamy like his grandfather. As a young child, Abelard was despised by his family for killing his mother. His father Quentin didn't pay enough attention to him, so when he joined the Jihad army, Vorian Atreides took him under his wing. Vorian felt guilty about not being able to clear Xavier's name all those years ago, so he sought a redemption through Abelard. He told him the truth about his grandfather's actions, and Abelard became a staunch revivalist thereafter. When he was confronted and ridiculed by the Sorceress Supreme Tissia Senva during a humanitarian mission to Ix, Abelard bit back and questioned the Sorceress's obsession with preserving bloodlines instead of humans, and he openly called himself a Harkonnen. Over the next couple of decades, he continued proving his worth as a tactician when he discovered and disabled a Piranha Mite colony on Seleucia Secundus alongside Vorian. The Atreides had taken it upon himself to protect his friend's legacy, and after years of looking after Abelard, he gave him the evidence he would need to clear his family's name once and for all. But then the Battle of Corran happened, and everything changed. Vorian, as Supreme Bashar of the forces of humanity, led a massive fleet to Corran to break through Omnius's defensive blockade and end his existence once and for all. When he reached the planet's orbit, he found himself faced with a severe quandary. In anticipation of a League attack, Omnius had put every last human being left on Corran into spaceships that he covered his planet's atmosphere with. Each of these ships was rigged to blow if an enemy fleet attempted to cross them, and the casualties would have been in the millions. Vorian had seen enough death throughout his entire life to even think twice about making the necessary sacrifice. He was there when Abelard's grandfather made the difficult but necessary decision of blowing up Earth using atomics. It killed Omnius Prime, but it also killed every human being that wasn't able to escape the planet before the nukes were launched. And this was the grim reality of the universe over during this time. The Great Purge, though a successful military tactic, resulted in the deaths of billions of humans, all because the League wanted to rid humanity of the machine scourge. Abelard might have understood the necessity of this sacrifice had Vorian let him be exposed to the worst of the fighting, but his protection is what ended up making him soft. When he learned that his idol wanted to sacrifice millions of humans for the sake of ending the war, he immediately refused to comply with orders and was confined. He escaped his confinement and disabled the ship's weaponry to minimize casualties, but turns out none of that was necessary. Among the hostages was one of Erasmus's favorite toys, the first Mentat Gilbertus Albans, and the independent machine disabled Omnius's explosives in an attempt to save his son. When Vorian's fleet crossed the Bridge of Hrethgir, nothing happened, and humanity ended up winning the millennia-long conflict against the Titans and the thinking machines with a degree of certainty. In the aftermath of the battle, when Fakan assumed his royal title, he wanted to execute Abelard for treason, but Vorian petitioned for the expulsion of Abelard from the burgeoning Imperium, and his request was promptly granted. Fakan sent his own brother to the backwater planet of Lankyvale, stripping him of all his ranks and prestige and leaving him disgraced for trying to save human lives. In his final years in exile, Abelard fathered 3 sons to whom he passed on his embittered legacy. And from that day forward, the Harkonnens have plotted their return to glory. As you can tell by now, there are several differences between their history from the Dune Encyclopedia and the one given to us by Brian Herbert, but the key events are still pretty much the same. The addition of honor and nobility to Abelard Harkonnen's tale of betrayal and Xavier's before him is a curious one, but one we can understand all the same. That's because if we didn't have those story notes, we wouldn't have the most underrated sci-fi show of this decade. Dune Prophecy builds upon the blocks laid down by the extended Dune-iverse, only it takes things a step further by talking about things that Brian and Kevin skipped out on. Rebels, Usurpers, and Galactic Manipulators. House Harkonnen's History of Betrayal. In the Dune Encyclopedia, the Harkonnens rebuilding their power wasn't much of an if question, it was more of a when. That's because though Shusett I banished Abelard Harkonnen, he didn't banish all Harkonnens, and it was Nikolai's branch that ended up creating troubles for his own family down the line. For the first 4 centuries, the Corrinos only had to worry about threats from their own branch families. The throne passed from one to the other at least a half a dozen times until Emperor Wallach Wallach I was put under a regency due to his blindness. During this time, the Bashar Henry al-Khair became emperor in all but name, and he put down a rebellion from the Lishash Confederacy with brutal tactics and exquisite violence. Henry's decisions during the Lishash Civil War led to the Landsraad jamming up his authority, and this was taken as an opportunity by Wallach's distant relative to make a play for the throne. Baron Sadir Harkonnen of the Duchy of Elazai ended Henry's reign by seizing the throne and declaring him Sadir III al-Harkonnen from the House of Rautha. Emperor Sadir didn't have a long reign, ruling the Imperium for just over a year, but during that time he did one thing that endured throughout the millennia. He designated Seleucia Secundus as the official prison planet of the Imperium, seeing as he had too many prisoners from the Lishash Civil War to deal with and not enough room to keep them. He was eventually murdered in the royal palace by Sardaukar forces still loyal to Wallach I, who reinstated him as emperor. Wallach ruled for 26 years, during which time he instituted the policy of training the Sardaukar on Seleucia, and he was succeeded by Shuset II, the last emperor from the original Carino branch of rulers. But during Shuset's rule, Sadir's son rose up in rebellion, taking control of the provincial Sardaukar, and after a brief battle, he ascended the Golden Lion throne as Sadir IV. This Sadir had escaped the massacre of his family by fleeing to his distant relative Yevgeny Harkonnen, the direct descendant of Abulurd, and in exchange for keeping him safe, he granted Yevgeny governance of Herdius as its count, as well as lands on the planet Powys. Thus did two Harkonnen bloodlines reconcile, and Sadir ruled the Imperium for 6 years. However, when he died thanks to an infected monkey bite, his line of House Harkonnen and the Imperial House of Rautha went extinct, making Yevgeny the scion of their ancient bloodline. With his death, the Duchy of Elazai went extinct as well, and the Harkonnens shifted their strategy from imperial domination to economic domination. They didn't make a direct play for the throne, but they did help prop up two separate dynasties, one of them led by another usurper. That usurper, whose name was Faid al-Faid, used a schism in the Sardaukar to gain imperial power, establishing the House of Faid. He did so with the backing of Alexander Harkonnen, whom he then executed, and whose son Vladimir continued the Harkonnen line once his persecution was ended. Vladimir nearly got his family great house status during his lifetime, but was blocked by an Atreides, who spoke against the Harkonnens given their involvement in the coup. The Atreides also reinstated a Carino to the throne after 2 generations of House Faid's suzerainty, and these usurpers, along with the House of Rautha, serve as the naming inspirations for Faid Rautha Harkonnen Raban, thousands of years down the line. 2 more Abulurds managed to get their family exiled because of their rebellious actions, but like a cockroach, House Harkonnen always survived the nuclear holocaust that was banishment. Instead of promoting open warfare, which was bad for imperial business, they became weapons merchants and industrialists, finally achieving great house status. Irakli Harkonnen was the man who finally elevated his house by creating and funding insurgency in the Imperium to undermine a regency council. When things got bad enough, he returned to the Imperium with their next Emperor Corran IV and was granted several boons by the Emperor in exchange. The Dune Encyclopedia takes the realistic world-building approach, so there are several cycles of usurpation, civil war, republican upheavals, and regency councils, so we apologize if all that felt confusing. But that's also kind of the point. The Harkonnens' rise and fall, and rise again, is always linked to an Atreides scuppering them at every turn, which deepens their rivalry and justifies it with each passing generation. The extended Dune-iverse pretty much only covers the reigns of the first 5 Carino emperors, and Javico isn't even mentioned extensively. And it also tries to make the Harkonnens feel nobler than they are, although that's not a problem that hinders prophecy. Rebuilding a power long lost. How Dune Prophecy makes the Harkonnens the universal axis. In the timeline created by Brian and Kevin, once Abulurd Harkonnen was banished, there was no branch family within the Imperium to instigate rebellions. In fact, the Harkonnens of the main story never really carry out a full-fledged scheme for usurping the throne, but that doesn't mean they don't make moves to gain more power. The 3 most important Harkonnens in the aftermath of Abulurd's banishment are Valia, Tula, and Griffin Harkonnen. Born to Sonya and Virgil Harkonnen on Lankyvale, this trio was aware of the truth about Abulurd's dismissal and fostered a deep resentment for the Atreides. Valia, in particular, was the instigator of all this, and that much at least has been retained by the show. Her parents and her uncle Evgeny, whose name seems to be inspired by the Yevgeny we mentioned earlier, were pacifists. They were content with living out a life of tranquility on their ice planet, making a living off of whale fur, but Valia wanted more. She knew her family was connected to the Imperial House itself, and that Vorian Atreides had lied, died, and in the novels, she didn't really want him to take back his words out of the kindness of his heart. Valia wanted to thoroughly destroy the Atreides, and she sent her brother Griffin to kill Vorian, not to talk things out. The Harkonnen scion was going to become their first representative to the Landsraad since their house was created, and he was going to revolutionize their fortunes with his ingenious manipulation of the whale fur market. Both of those dreams died in the desert when he lost a duel to Vorian Atreides, and according to Valia, that's what got him killed. For the rest of her life, whenever someone would speak highly of Vorian or even suggest a peace between his family and Valia's, she'd mentally mark them out as enemies, for her sole purpose was getting revenge for her brother and her family. It's the reason she joined the sorceresses of Rossack, not Griffith's death, which is given as prophecy's reason for her joining the Sisterhood. In fact, she didn't even send Griffith on his mission until after she begins her training, because it's during a diplomatic visit to Seleucus Secundus that she even realizes Vorian is alive. When her brother dies, her family changes its crest to a griffin, which has remained House Harkonnen's sigil ever since. The movies might make their symbol look more like the black sun of Getty Prime, but if you squint hard enough, it really does look like a minimalist interpretation of a griffin. There are many such differences between the established lore and what happens in the show, such as the fact that Valia never goes to Rossack and that she discovers the voice during a childhood accident as opposed to perfecting it during her sisterhood training. In the novels, Valia even trains with the Swordmasters of Ginaz, the same school that Kieran Atreides belongs to, which explains her badass skills as a fighter. But what is consistent, once again, is the fact that she becomes the vessel through which House Harkonnen rises in the Imperium. Griffin might be gone, but her other brother, Danvis, still lived, and she switched to using him to enter her house into the Landsraad. Things didn't go exactly as planned, because in a plot to neutralize an Atreides competitor, Danvis ends up getting betrayed by his own cousin, Gerhard. But it is implied that he recovered from that ambush and eventually reclaimed his seat on the High Council by taking out his own flesh and blood. Valia, in the meantime, rose through the ranks of the Sisterhood through manipulation and murder, and eventually became the first Mother Superior of the Bene Gesserit Mother School on Wallach 9. The prequel novels are more focused on her vendetta with the Atreides, and to be honest with you guys, that's a valid point. Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson spent a lot of time establishing the idea that the Harkonnens were wronged to the point that they might have ended up negating established canon. On multiple occasions, their Harkonnen and Atreides characters made peace with each other, but because this peace is made in isolated environments, it never holds. And even if it reaches the higher-ups of House Harkonnen, they refuse to believe it. The truth is that Valia's anger towards Vorian Atreides is completely misplaced. She thinks that he took two ancestors, a brother, and her family's chance at an ambitious life away from them, but she is so blinded by rage that she's willing to overlook what actually happened. Griffin wasn't killed by Vorian. He tracked the hero of the Jihad to a Fremen siege in Arrakis where he'd exiled himself and fought a duel with him which was supposed to be to the death. The Fremen rule of Amtol dictates that a duel for honor needs to be until death, and we all know that a Fremen doesn't sheathe their crysknife until it's drawn blood. But Griffin let Vorian live despite having him beat because he adhered to a different code of honor. The Fremen were exceptional warriors, but they didn't abide to a code of chivalry. The Harkonnens, being former nobility, did, and Griffin proved to Vorian that it wasn't too late to repair burnt bridges. The two of them made peace on Arrakis, but then the Fremen cast them out into the desert for violating their society's rules. Once out there, Griffin was killed by Vorian's Titan brother and sister, Andros and Hyla, and he avenged him by getting Agamemnon's legacy devoured by Shai-Hulud. Vorian sent a letter to Valia explaining what had happened and apologizing for his role in things, but she didn't believe him. He ended up anonymously investing in her family's whale fur business as a means to make amends, and even visited his family on Caladan, whom he'd left behind decades ago. Vorian was there when his descendant, Ori Atreides, got married to a girl called Tula Vale, but when he found Ori massacred, he knew who was responsible and why. Vorian traveled to Lanky Vale with his descendant Willem, who's been renamed Albert in Prophecy, to seek out Ori's murderer, and that led him to Chusak. Tula nearly died at their hands, and the Sisterhood saved her at the last possible minute. This entire storyline was skipped over in Prophecy, but maybe it hasn't been. We know that Valia Harkonnen is going to be on Arrakis in Season 2, and that's where her brother passed away. She may or may not know this, but there's no way she won't find out, and this will only lead to tensions between her and her new traveling companion, Kieran Atreides. We think if they're both present for the revelation, they will have wildly differing reactions to it, because Kieran might choose to believe it, but Valia certainly won't. She's allowed Tula her moment of respite because she loves her sister and she helped her beat back Desmond's new machine virus. But if Tula ever betrays her like this again, then she might not be so inclined to spare her the indoctrination. In the novels, once she rescues her life, Valia basically turns Tula into an Atreides killer. her, and this culminates in a climactic showdown where she hides her pregnancy even as she fights for her life. In fact, Tula uses her pregnancy to save herself, which is very different from the show's version of events. In the show, she gives birth to her son shortly after becoming a sister because she isn't tracked to Chuseok by Vorian and Willem. She's in a safe environment for her, but she knows the same can't be said for her child. Tula might have been new to the Sisterhood, but Valia had spent years creating her power base and garnered many enemies. Killing the Atreides to avenge their brother's death was one thing, but seeing Valia kill all of Dorothy's followers in cold blood just because they wouldn't conform to her way of thinking made Tula see the real monster in her. And when her sister told her that her child had the potential to shape the future of the Imperium, Tula became afraid for its life. She ended up swapping it out with a stillborn baby because she wanted her son to choose his own fate, but that decision backfired decades later, because now he's returned as the weapon called Desmond Hart. But therein lies the greatest secret of the hidden history of House Harkonnen. Desmond is the reason the Kwisatz Haderach was ever made. Over the course of the first season, Dune Prophecy has given us many clues to the fact that the Sisterhood's breeding program is due for an evolution. In Episode 1, it was introduced as a means for breeding better leaders and producing bloodlines that the Sisterhood could control, but thanks to the Prophecy of the Reckoning, the Order's priorities have shifted. They're now looking for the key that can help them avoid the Tyrant's judgment, and while they think that will come by killing Desmond Hart, they'll soon realize it's actually about replicating his life's circumstances. There are a couple of characters that are candidates for being the twice born, Desmond and Lila, and to be honest with you guys, we think the Kwisatz Haderach prophecy is a reference to both of them. Lila's prescience has awakened in a form unlike anything the Sisterhood has previously encountered. She's clearly linked to all her maternal ancestors, and it's her lack of training that has caused her to become an abomination. On the other hand, while Desmond might not exactly be prescient, he certainly has qualities that make him appear like the Revenant full of scars, and he most definitely has the lineage that would eventually lead to the creation of the Kwisatz. An Atreides-Harkonnen union is said to have unmapped potential according to Dune Prophecy. That potential, combined with Lila's abomination and the Reckoning prophecy, will lead the two wolves of the series to a single conclusion, that they need to create a twice-born of their own under their own control. In Episode 1, Mother Rakella tells Valia to use every tool available to advance the Sisterhood's standing, and when she emerges as an abomination, she doesn't seem to mind the unorthodox methods involved. We're sure she also wouldn't object to Valia engineering the Kwisatz Haderach program, but what she will have a problem with is how she uses it to achieve her own house's glory. We don't think the original novels were trying to make the Atreides-Harkonnen rivalry the core component of the Kwisatz Haderach program. It was supposed to be yet another example of how the Bene Gesserit achieve multiple ends through a single means. But having an Atreides daughter marry a Harkonnen son and then having them produce another son, whom they would then presumably marry to Princess Irulan, they'd have achieved a smorgasbord of political legitimacy. The Harkonnens, being descended from the Butlers, can claim the Golden Lion throne by merging their blood with the Atreides, and it was the Sisterhood's hope that they would end their dynastic rivalry. Irulan was a trained Bene Gesserit, much like her mother and sisters, and this would surround the planned Kwisatz with agents of the Sisterhood's will. Through blood and tradition, he would bind up the political wounds of the Imperium, and with his powerful prescient mind, he would guide them to the next stage of human evolution. Yes, this would make the Harkonnens the Imperial House, but that didn't matter so long as the Sisterhood could control who was on the throne, and technically, the Kwisatz Haderach was supposed to be one of their own. A major focus of Prophecy has been getting a sister on the throne. Valia is only invested in Princess Inez so much because she needs to convert her and turn her into a dummy empress. She believes that Inez will be the sister on the throne, but ultimately, that sister would be the male Kwisatz. That way, they don't upset the universal balance maintained through male primogeniture, and they also get bonus access to male memories, something the Sisterhood had always lacked. By introducing Desmond Hart and making his Atreides-Harkonnen lineage an integral part of his twice-born status, Prophecy has made House Harkonnen the driving force of the universe, and that's due in no small part to Valia. Right now, the Sisterhood is split right down the middle, but if Prophecy is going to stick with the established canon, then her faction will emerge victorious eventually. When they do, they'll recalibrate their breeding program to foster genes that will birth the Kwisatz, and maybe Valia will also be the one to establish the Missionaria Protectiva. Her presence on Arrakis can have several implications for the world of Dune, but what's clear as day is the fact that she's been put in the driver's seat of a car called Universal Fate, and she's driving in the fast lane. We don't hear of many Harkonnens after her and Danvis, and Danvis' son Harrow, But that last name at least reminds us of the Baron. Harro Harkonnen is a master of subterfuge, adept at making himself appear harmless when in reality he's a predator. He's recorded his aunt confessing to high treason and is sure to make use of this information to advance his own ambitions now that he's the official head of House Harkonnen. In that, he'll be much like his descendant Vladimir, who's the Baron we all love to hate. Vladimir's rise to power is described differently across the various Dune sources, but all of them agree that he represented the pinnacle of Harkonnen power and perversion. The Villeneuve films did a decent enough job of conveying his brutality and gluttony, and we suppose that there's an extended cut out there somewhere that shows us exactly what happened to those maids that Feyd-Rautha killed while testing his blade. But there are things from the novels that simply cannot be adapted for screen, like the fact that pretty much everyone in the Harkonnen household is drugged up all the time, and that the Baron has a disgusting taste for little boys as bed slaves. In fact, he once tried to rape Feyd, but the young Baron outwitted his uncle by implanting a poison needle in his own thigh that nearly ended Vladimir's life. Compared to that, the Baron trying to get Feyd killed during a gladiatorial battle when he was supposed to be this elite warrior falls kind of flat in our opinion. Through his philosophy of minimizing costs and maximizing profits, Vladimir Harkonnen turned his house into quite possibly the wealthiest great house in the entire Imperium. Apart from their whale fur assets on Lanky Vale, the Harkonnens also used their Gedi Prime resources to become a formidable military-industrial complex, and their Siradar barony over Arrakis gave them access to the most important resource in the universe. During the 80 years the House Harkonnen ruled Dune, they illegally hoarded billions of Solaris worth of spice, and that was after meeting their absurdly high monthly quota. By the time the Atreides took power on Arrakis, they'd pretty much sucked it as dry as possible and sabotaged all means by which the Atreides could harvest more spice. While most of the Imperium thinks that House Atreides got Dune from the Harkonnens for their exemplary reputation and the Duke Leto's contributions to galactic peace, the real reason was the Baron. He used Leto's accomplishments to poison the Emperor's mind against him, eventually gaining Shaddam's approval for eradicating the Atreides. Vlad spent 60 years worth of spice for the Atreides extermination, and for a few years there, he thought he'd actually succeeded. Arrakis was returned to him as his imperial fief after Leto's death, and in case the Emperor ever wanted to reveal their little secret, Vladimir could simply reveal the involvement of the Sardaukar in the attack, which would turn all of the great houses against the Emperor. The entire point of creating the Landsraad and Chom was to keep the Padishah in check. By controlling the number of votes he had and imposing restrictions on his authorization of full-scale invasions, in accordance with the Great Convention, the Imperium experienced an unprecedented period of intergalactic human peace. Sure, there were internal conflicts within the Empire, but they were codified so well that it never threatened the integrity of the Imperium as a whole. Shaddam, taking the decision to send in Sardaukar, invalidated those checks and balances and opened him up to banishment, following which Vladimir hoped to install Feyd-Rautha as the next emperor. His plan was solid and based in sound logic, but the one thing he didn't account for was his own oversight. The Harkonnens, in their pursuit for supremacy, ended up underestimating all their enemies, and in most cases that works out just fine for them because their enemies are just regular humans. But when they're desert demons like the Fremen, underestimating them is the worst mistake you can make, and that's exactly what happens. Paul and Jessica end up gaining the Fremen's trust by using the Missionaria Protectiva that Valia will introduce to the planet if our predictions about Season 2 come true. Go check out that video if you haven't already because it's fascinating, but the point we're trying to make here is that House Harkonnen's downfall is the same thing that made them rise in the first place: their obsession. They were so obsessed with reclaiming their legacy and punishing those that tainted it that they failed to consider how their actions would come back to haunt them. And from that perspective, Valia Harkonnen's greatest achievement will also turn out to be her greatest failure. She will set up the Kwisatz Haderach program in the hope that once her sisterhood has consolidated all the power it needs, her surviving relatives would be smart enough to follow the path she's laid out for them. But she has no way of knowing that the grandmother of the Kwisatz will betray her order 10 million years removed from it, so she can't predict that House Harkonnen's rise to power will only be a blip on the universal scale. When Muad'Dib and his forces slaughter Vladimir, Feyd, and Glossu Raban, they take out the three-headed beast of the Harkonnen hegemony. Any of their remaining relatives on Lanky Vale are left untouched, and they eventually fade into extinction. Gedi Prime is given to Gurney Halleck as his fief, and he rechristens it Gamu, a name that takes millennia to finally stick, but stick it does. And as for the Great House of Harkonnen, it is subsumed within the Golden Lion throne when Paul declares himself the last living Harkonnen. It's bloody ironic that the last living Harkonnens who remembered their Harkonnen history were all Atreides, those being Paul, his sister Aaliyah, and his children Leto the Elder, Leto II, and Ganima. Eventually, the Corrino dynasty would be absorbed by the Atreides name as well, when Leto II would turn the last son of the Corrinos, Harkonnen, into his sister Ganima's concubine. Every story or video game that uses the concept of fate in its narrative basically amounts to a single warning. Don't try to manipulate things on a global level in the name of pushing humanity towards its destiny, because you won't like how it backfires on you. And perhaps if Valia Harkonnen had undergone the Spice Agony instead of the Rossack one, she could have foreseen how her decision to create the Kwisatz would backfire on her. But alas, we all know how that story ends. What we've been trying to impress upon you guys for over 40 minutes now is that House Harkonnen's hidden history has shaped the Imperium in more ways than anyone could have guessed, and well, now you know the truth. Marvelous verdict! With that being said, we hope you enjoyed this video because it will be the last one we do on Dune Prophecy. The response to Season 1 has been amazing, so you can definitely expect us to be back with all the breakdowns for Season 2, but until then, let us know what you guys think about House Harkonnen's indispensable contributions to the history of Dune. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Wizard Wheezy signing off for now, but you can always find me on Twitch. Have a good day, and we'll see you guys in our next marvelous video.